Hopefully you can hear me and see me. There is a chat box at the bottom of each of the webinars, so you can get involved, ask questions, comment as you go, and I'll be able to interact with you. So, if you just want to say hi, or if you have a comment or a question as we go along, then feel free to use that chat box, and then we'll do a bit of a Q&A at the end. What tends to happen with these webinars is people sort of jump in and out of them, and so sometimes there are a lot more people here, and then sometimes there's only a couple of you. This is being recorded so that I can share it afterwards, and so that people can get access to it if they were busy today, or if they missed out. So this will be available on YouTube afterwards. And this webinar today is the psychology of victim blaming in sexual violence. So as this is advertised to begin at midday, I'm not going to start teaching on the material until midday, just in case somebody misses something important. But yeah, so feel free to sort of get an idea of how this platform works. At the moment, you can hear and see me, hopefully, and you can chat, so you can use the chat facility at the bottom, but you cannot speak to me at the moment, so and you can't speak to each other. I'm still learning how to use the settings, but I think I actually can change that later. So if after the presentation's finished, if you do have, headphones, microphone, or if you're in a place where you can talk, I think I actually can shift the settings over so we can talk to each other afterwards. If not, you are absolutely welcome to just ask your questions in the chat box at the bottom. And as I said, I don't mind when you put them there. I'll address them as we go along. You're absolutely welcome to, make comments, ask questions. And in the other webinars, people have just sort of, ended up chatting in the chat box about things that they've seen, or ideas that they have, theories that they've read, books that they've read, things like that. So feel free to do that too. So we are at midday, so I'm going to get us started. So thank you so much for joining me. This is the webinar around the psychology of victim blaming in sexual violence. Obviously, this is what I nerd out on. So I love talking about stuff. I could talk about this all day. So I'm going to take you through some of the key theories, explanations, evidence that we have around victim blaming, and some things around self-blame as well in sexual violence. And I am actually going to show you some of my new stuff that hasn't come out yet, because it is the most up-to-date stuff on victim blaming. But I'm also going to show you, some of the key things that I have learned, and some of the key theories that we need to understand why victim blaming is so prevalent. Because generally, when you question people about it, when you sort of really dig at it, people say to you, oh, well, obviously it's the perpetrator's fault. And you think, well, if it was that obvious, why do millions and millions and millions of people who experience sexual violence, who are subjected to sexual violence all over the world, they are very likely to be blamed for that sexual violence? So, if it's so obvious that perpetrators, hold all of the responsibility, hold all of the fault, the blame, and we'll talk about that in a minute around linguistics, then why do we do it? Why is it in the media? Why is it, so prevalent in law, in policing, in healthcare, in social care, and that's what I'm interested in. So before we get going, let's just have a look. Hopefully I can switch over slides. Okay, and also I can zoom in on them, which is quite helpful, because apparently, sometimes if the models are quite small, I'll zoom in and let you have a sort of a better look at them. Key questions are: why do we blame victims of sexual violence and abuse? What are the key theories that can help us to understand victim blaming? And what's the latest evidence in the literature? So I'm going to take you through all of that. But before we do, it's just about looking after yourself. Obviously, I'm going to be discussing sexual violence. I'm going to be discussing concepts of blame, experiences of victim blaming, and self-blame as well. So it really is about looking after yourself. It's a different dynamic if I'm not teaching you face to face, because I can't make sure you're okay and tell when you need a break. So you just take a break whenever you need a break. I do not use graphic imagery or videos around rape or abuse or anything like that. So that's not something that's going to come up. I don't have any graphic descriptions. I don't think of any type of sexual violence or rape or abuse, but there is, obviously like quite clear conversations around rape, sexual violence, abuse, and then, people being blamed for it. So it's just to look after yourself, really. People often don't realize that the discussions around blame and cause and responsibility can sometimes be triggers. So just look after yourself, please. And sort of step away and click out if you need a break. In terms of principles, everything I deliver is from a trauma-informed, strength-based perspective around mental health and well-being and psychology, which means I draw a lot on social models and ethical models explanations rather than sort of individualizing things into people's brains or sort of into diagnoses and things like that. I'm interested in the whole context that we live in. And the webinar also draws upon radical feminist approaches to understanding oppression and categorization of women and girls in society. So that means seeing women and girls as a group globally who are oppressed, who are trafficked, who are held in slavery, that don't have the same, chances, opportunities all over the world. And, that includes racism, classism, as well as sexism. So that's the sort of angle that I come from in the work that I do. And then I've also got evidence today from different peer-reviewed studies, from the media, from national and international reports, and then also some new stuff from my PhD, which is done now, thank goodness. Just got to wait for Viva and then hopefully I can have a rest. Okay, so what I would like you to do, if you are able to, is just take a few minutes to think about the reasons why people might be blamed for being sexually abused or attacked in some way. So harassment, rape, sexual assault, sexual exploitation. Think about all the reasons that you have heard. So it could be what they were wearing, where they went, who they were with, where they're from, their single parent background, anything like that. So just a couple of minutes. I'm going to go quiet. If you just think it through, if you want to jot them down, if you want to just think about them, then let's do that. I'll do the same actually. So okay. I've scribbled a lot down, but it's not very fair it's doing this because this is what I do, this is what I think about all the time. So, oh, that's not a good noise. You shouldn't be able to hear that. Okay, so look at your list. Why do you think people are blamed for being sexually abused? Now, I am happy for you to put this in the chat box at the bottom. What do you think? What is your opinion on this? Why are we doing this? Is it self-preservation? Is it sexism? What what are we doing? Why are we blaming victims? What do we get out of it? What does society get out of it? Is it denial? Is it about us not having to deal with the massive issues of sexual violence and abuse that we have in our society? So I'd be really, interested to see why you think we do this. So if you started thinking about that list, or if you started considering all of the reasons that you have heard people blame victims of sexual violence, why though? Why do we do this? Why is the list so big? If we were to sit here and we were to sit together round a table and list every single time we've heard somebody blame a victim of sexual violence, it would be a list as long as our arm, without a shadow of a doubt. But why? And that's what I'm interested in. Why do we do that? So if you have any ideas, just pop them in the chat box at the bottom. Um, and I am going to have a quick look at our next slides. I can see some of you are typing, so I will wait for you and see what you think, because I am honestly, I'm always interested in people's perspectives on this. People tend to come at it from different backgrounds and different, opinions on why it is that we actually do this. And the reality is that it it it'll probably be a big mixture of everything you're about to write in the chat box. So I can see you all typing away. Are you writing me a thesis? Can I nick it and put it in mine? Okay, makes us feel safer if we think it's something we won't do. Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk about that as we go on. Victim blaming is really important for self-preservation. So you're absolutely right that we should consider, victim blaming to be a reaction to keep us psychologically safe. So if we can convince ourselves that we wouldn't do those things, or we wouldn't make those mistakes, or we're not like that person, then that can convince us that there's a small chance or a lesser chance that that could happen to us. We also do that with children. So, for example, I come across a lot of professionals who work in our field of abuse and sexual violence who will say to me, "Oh, well, that would never happen to our children because, we both work in the field and they go to a nice school and they live in a nice area. So, we're different. It wouldn't happen to our kids." And that's that self-preservation kicking in. They're doing it to protect themselves. Helen, I think it makes people feel safer to blame the victim if you can make it about the closer actions or behaviours and say, yeah, absolutely, yeah, you're right. So this is exactly what we're talking about. It's that sort of, if you can make it about something singular and something about the individual, if you can individualize sexual violence into the human, into that person, into that woman, or into that man, or even into that child, you don't have to deal with the huge issue of societal sexual violence. Um, okay, so Verity, totally agree. If people blame victims out of knowledge, yeah, absolutely. And do you know what's really interesting about this is that this is actually only one theory. So you're all actually only talking about one theory, which is that sort of self-preservation type stuff. Um, I think we demonize women, Catherine said. Yeah, exactly. So the other sort of one of the other alternative views would be actually this is coming from misogyny, is that, we find a way to blame the woman and or the girl, because obviously those of you that work with girls will know that it doesn't really matter if the female is an adult or if she's 11 or 12 years old. You will get these really misogynistic, sexist values placed on her about what she was wearing, how she behaves, how she presents herself, and things like that. Yeah, you're right. So Jessica's just added that it's easier for some to stay quiet and side with the perpetrator rather than listen. Yeah, you're right. And in some cases that's going to be an easier life. It's an easier life maybe to not put yourself out there, put yourself at risk by backing up a victim. And yet, often I hear people say things like, "Well, how do you know victims telling the truth? We can't just back victims up. We can't just expect that they're all telling the truth. What if they're all lying? What if we're sending innocent people to prison?" And the reality is, in fact, I was having this conversation yesterday. I don't think people fully understand what a victim would go through to even disclose or report. Reporting rates in the UK have been dropping for years. And what I find really interesting is that people keep saying they're going up. But actually, if you look at the proportion of how many people are subjected to sexual violence in the UK every year versus how many actually report to the police, it's actually been dropping for years. It used to sit at about 17%, then it went to 15%, then it went 14%, and we're now at 13%. So around 13% of people who are subjected to sexual violence actually report it. So it's not going up, it's going down. And it might just be that it's more visible in the media, so it feels like more and more people are coming forward. But in terms of actually reporting it to the police, that's going down, that's not going up. Um, Okay, so there isn't necessarily one profile for a sex offender. It stops us trying to look for one by blaming the victim as well. Yeah, you're right. And we do have a real, we're not going to get into this massively in this seminar, but you're right. We have a real issue around this sort of stereotypical sex offender, this homogenous sex offender. They're all the same. They all think the same. They all attack vulnerable people. They all, they all think the same. And it's just not true. It, it actually, it's really dumbing us down. It's dumbing the whole field down to believe that oh, all sex offenders are hyper intelligent, all sex offenders groom vulnerable people. It doesn't make any sense. And none of the theories of sex offending actually back that up. It's just us, in our worlds, in social care, working in psychology, therapy, that have this narrative that, oh, sex offenders are these really intelligent groomers, and they're, really socially intelligent, and they look for vulnerable victims. That the sex offender theory doesn't back that up. Actual research with sex offenders, interviews with sex offenders, doesn't back that up. That's our narrative we've fed ourselves. It's easier for us if we believe that these sex offenders are like super intelligent and like sort of sleuthing around in our social circles, and there's nothing anybody can do. And you're right, it will then eventually, sorry, I don't know why I keep doing that. Eventually we'll get to the point where we'll feel like it's so difficult to challenge sex offenders, we will look for what's wrong with victims. So when we get to a point in our practice where we think, CSE is a good example of this, where they say, we don't know how to disrupt the sex offenders, we don't know who the sex offenders are, we don't have the money or the resources to use covert operations, and therefore we try to change the child, we try to move the child, we place them elsewhere, we do healthy relationships work with them, and that is because we don't know what we're doing with offenders. So we've got to a point where we've lost our confidence with that. We've had some big blows, like, for example, the sex offender treatment program. That was just diabolical, because the sex offender treatment program was found to actually increase sex offending. And the way that we were using it was incorrect. The sex offender treatment program was always developed to be an individually tailored, specific program for each sex offender. And because of resources cuts and things like that, it turned into, 25 sex offenders in a classroom together talking about their sexual offences. And obviously that changes the way that we worked with them, and it changed the outcomes. And so once we get to a point where we're sort of thinking, we don't know what to do anymore with these sex offenders, we do get to the point where we think, well, what we could do is just change the victim. And Emma, that's exactly what you've just put, and you're right. You get to the point where victim blaming starts to look like prevention work. It starts to look like, protect yourself, prevent yourself from being raped. And actually what we're doing is holding our hands up and sort of being, we don't know what we're doing with these rapists and sex offenders, so what we're going to do is change the victims instead. And that is a bitter pill to swallow. Like, some people do not like me making that point at all. I'm just going to zoom in on this because it seems like super tiny. Oh, not that big. Good God. Okay. So what is victim blaming? So it's the act of transferring the blame for an act of sexual violence away from the perpetrator, placing the blame on the person they've offended against. I have put there often called the victim, and I guess that's because some people hate being called a victim. And I also don't use the term survivor in my work because some people hate being called a survivor. And actually, there's this really interesting piece of research. If you ever want it, just email me and ask me for it, about that language. And it was with quite a high number of women. Done, I think it was about 2014, 15, was sort of talking to women about what they want to be called. Do they want to be a victim? Are they a survivor? Do they feel like that's the label for them and stuff like that? And actually, it was very mixed. Some women hated survivor, some women hated victim, some women really felt like they were a victim, they're a victim of crime, they're legally a victim, and that's the title they wanted. Some women really wanted to be known as a survivor because it empowered them. And in the end, I got to the point where, when I was writing the thesis and when I write other documents, I actually don't use either of those terms anymore. I use women subjected to sexual violence or men subjected to sexual violence, because they have been subjected to sexual violence by another human who chose to do that to them. It's not up to me to call them a victim or a survivor, especially if it's going to put people off or sort of feel like that's a value laden type label. And the other thing that you'll notice here, I've got a little pencil, look, I can make it move. Okay, so the other thing that you'll notice here is that I'm very specifically talking about blame. And that's because there has been a lot of research that has mixed up concepts of blame, cause, responsibility, and fault for getting on 60, 70 years now. It was first picked up in 1958 in some theoretical research around blame, where an author noticed that people were sort of saying in one breath, I don't know, for example, maybe they were asking participants, how much do you think this woman was to blame for sexual violence? But in the write-up of the paper, it would say participants assigned responsibility to the victims. It's like, no, they didn't. You didn't ask them about responsibility. You asked them about blame. And actually, when we do studies to ask people, how much do you think this person is to blame for rape or sexual violence? If I was to ask them the exact same question, but say, how much do you think they should be held responsible for what happened? Or if I ask them, how much do you think their actions caused what happened to them? Or if I used fault, do you think it was this person's fault what happened to them? Those four terms will give you four different answers. You should try it. Try it in a team meeting, try it on somebody. They give you different answers. And sometimes you'll get somebody say something like, I don't believe victims are, at fault for sexual violence, and I don't believe they're to blame. I just think they need to take more responsibility for their personal safety, and they need to understand that some of their actions might have caused this to happen. So they've got like this word salad. All four words will get used in one sentence, and actually they mean different things. So I'm very specific about this sort of talking about blame. Because if we start talking about responsibility, cause, and fault, this is going to get extremely messy extremely quickly. And so I wanted to talk to you about how prevalent victim blaming was. So I've got some really interesting examples here. And you've got the citations at the bottom, and I will tell you what they are so you can go away and find them if you're interested in it. So the first one is the Fawcett Society's report from 2017, and this is important because it directly asked UK public, how much do you think women are to blame for rape? And you can see there, I'll just show it to you here. So 38% of men said that women who are raped are totally or partially to blame, and 34% of women. And what's really interesting about this finding is that it's, I think people think that women victim blame women less than men do because of the misogyn sexism type argument. But actually, the research over the years has shown us that that's not true. So this is not a statistically significant difference. So even in my own work, which I'll show you later as we go on, in my own work, I did not find a difference between men and women. So when I asked men and women to use a sliding scale to sort of tell me how much do you think the woman is to blame in each scenario, how much do you think the man is to blame in each scenario, when I did the inferential statistics to have a look at, did the women blame more or less than the men? There was no difference at all, no statistical significant difference at all. And that I'm not the first person to find that. That's been being found now for probably getting on 10, 15 years. If you go back into the older literature, it was always men that blamed women more. And as you get newer and newer and newer sort of into the more contemporary literature, you actually find that disappears and it starts to become, it starts to become very close. Which obviously raises issues and questions about is this internalized misogyny? Is this the way the media has presented sexual violence to women and girls? But then you can see down here, which is really interesting, women over 65 were the most likely group to blame a victim of rape, to blame other women. So 55% of the women in this age group agreed that women who are raped are totally or partially to blame. So this is really interesting because it's a very specific demographic, and then we could start having conversations about, is this about gender role stereotypes? Is this about the era that these women were brought up in. Is this because of the way people have treated these women their entire lives, to the point where they have accepted blame, they've accepted that, you know, the sexual violence was normal or whatever it is, and then they're placing those values onto other women. I felt this finding was so interesting and actually warrants a lot more research. And if we go up to this one, I remember reading this when I first found this study. So police officers who work in specialist sexual violence units actually blame victims more. And whenever I teach about this, people sort of think, well, that doesn't make any sense, because, you know, the officers that are doing the job all the time working in sexual violence should be better at the job than, you know, the officers that maybe only come across it once or twice on the beat, or, you know, that they don't specialize in it at all. They work in the ASB team, or, you know, they work in fraud, or whatever. And I think what's interesting about this finding was that what it means is that because of the way the UK criminal justice system works, the longer you work in a prosecution role, so police, CPS, in sexual violence, rape and abuse in this country, the longer you have to become influenced by stereotypes. So, for example, an officer might learn over 7-8 years of working in that specialist sexual violence unit that those types of rapes get through to the CPS and those ones get to trial and these ones don't. So actually, they'll drop those ones. So they'll think, well, you know, what's the balance of probability that I'm going to get that to court after all this work? Probably not. We'll just NFA it now. And this research has, you know, this has been found repeatedly, actually, that if police forces hold a stereotype of what is a real rape or what is a real victim, and then if they use those stereotypes to apply them to cases in CSE or in rape or in, you know, sexual assault or exploitation or anything, if they keep seeing the same cases over and over again, it causes confirmation bias. So they get to the point where they think, well, you know, the last 10 cases that went through that looked like that all got to court. So obviously that must mean that that's a good type of case, that's a credible victim. And these cases, you know, I don't know, for example, whenever the person has a disability, or if it's a teenage girl who has been sexually exploited, those ones never get anywhere. So, you know, these ones must be the real rapes, these are the credible victims, and these are the ones that we don't really need to be spending time and money on. So those officers, because they are constantly exposed to stereotypical cases that go forward and become successful at prosecution, those are the ones that, you know, they keep going through, they keep being successful, they eventually influence the officers, that those are the real ones, those are the credible cases. I'm just reading what you've put, Emma. Well, yeah, and that's basically what this study showed, was that the prosecutors and police are looking at, is this case strong enough? Is this person credible enough? So if the person has a learning disability, do they have mental health issues? Have they reported to the police before? Are they a repeat victim? Have they retracted statements before? And once those, like, I guess it's a horrible way to put it, but like negative factors crop up and crop up and crop up, in their head they're thinking, this isn't going to go anywhere. I'm not even going to get this past the CPS. And at that point, they stop, they NFA it, and they think this isn't a strong enough case. And what was really interesting, in more recent research, it was actually found that officers were making those decisions even when CPS would have taken it forward. So there were some studies that looked at, you know, what was happening when officers were deciding to just NFA a case, and then CPS were being, you know, asked to have a look at it later down the line. CPS going, oh, we would have taken that forward. Like, why did this not get us? We could have given you the advice to get this case through. And the officers being, oh, I didn't think it'd go anywhere. So that one's an interesting finding. And then we have got some research that I did that you can have a read of. It's free on the website, where I looked at attitudes and values in police officers on the Isle of Man. So I had every single police officer in my sample. They were really, the force was really good. They were really wanted to participate in it. and I measured their attitudes towards children, boys and girls who were being sexually exploited. You know, I think they had about 30 or 40 psychometric sort of liquor items. Um, and they were able to agree or disagree with particular statements. And I put statements in there that were like, oh, I don't know, I think there was an item in there that said boys who are being sexually exploited are usually just experimenting. And then there's another one in there that says things like social media um, is the reason why girls get exploited and stuff. And it was like, it had some very overt statements in there that called girls like promiscuous. And then in other cases, they were very subtly worded. So I had something like, um, parents should be held responsible if their children get sexually exploited by someone else, and to look for parent blaming and things like that. And my findings showed that um, the pre-testing of their values, I got all of that data, went out to the Isle of Man, retrained absolutely everybody there, and then tested them again. And it was one of the most depressing studies I've ever done, because we spent all that time doing that. And the findings were that you can shift knowledge but not values. So if an officer held a very, very strong value about children being sexually exploited, that they were promiscuous, they were a waste of time, that they were bad kids, it didn't matter how much training I put into that officer, I couldn't shift that. But what I could shift was knowledge. So when I did a knowledge test with them pre and post, that increased hugely. So if I put things like, you know, the what is the age of consent, and beforehand maybe X amount of officers didn't know the answer, and then at the end of the training afterwards, when I tested them again, nearly 100% of them knew the answer. Knowledge, I increased. Values, I did not. I gave a speech about it at Nota, and like you could feel the whole room being like, "Oh, now what do we do?" So it was a pretty depressing finding, but it was important because we've got this. I think we've got this theory in social care and in policing that good training means good workers, and actually, if their value base is wrong, then there's not that much that training can achieve with them. They would need supervision, constant challenge, stuff like that. Um, do police officers become more hardened the more they're exposed to certain type of crime? Yes, that's in the literature everywhere. If you need anything to back that up, that is super easy to find. They absolutely do. They're humans. They get desensitized. They become hardened to it. They start seeing certain cases as severe and certain cases as like not that severe. And it's the same with social workers. It's the same with any of us, really. You're human. You don't get away from burnout, trauma, vicarious trauma, desensitization. You really don't. Okay, let's have a look at another one. 100% of the episodes in the first 10 seasons of NCIS blames the victim for their rape or abuse. Now, this is such an interesting book. I think I have it behind me. Where did it go? It's just going to be a video of me looking through books now, isn't it? It's not that helpful, really. It's up here somewhere. Oh, there it is. Okay, hang on a minute. I've got this thing. One sec. I'll show it to you. I've knotted my wire and everything, super professional. Okay, so I will show you this. It's called Assault on the Small Screen. You see there Molly's name, Molly Magistro, and you can see that's who I've cited at the bottom of here. This book is incredible. I don't even know how I found it. I think we researched at the beginning of the PhD, and it just blew me away. It's about the way that all different forms of sexual violence are depicted on primetime TV, so on dramas, soaps, crime investigation programs, and things like that. I absolutely love this book. Let's just shove it there for now. And so one of the findings, just one of the findings, because there was so much in that book that I took in, 100% of episodes in the first 10 seasons of NCIS blame the victim for the abuse. So Molly did this sort of like content and discourse analysis on every single episode. It must have taken her years. And she found this finding. And what you've got to remember about this is that millions of people watch NCIS. And so they're watching this stuff on TV. They're at home after work. It's influential. It's also people think NCIS and like those types of dramas are quite credible. They come from like an authoritative point of view, you know. And so she found language in there like Office saying things like, "Oh, she went and got herself raped again." And so that type of language, when it's repeated over, you know, seasons, episodes, over and over again, that women cause rape, they're blamed for rape and abuse, you know, it's going to have an impact on the audience. And then the last one is from I'm so sorry. I have a knack of ruining things for people. The other one's Twilight. I've absolutely destroyed Twilight with Claire Patterson Young in the Little Orange Book. Sorry about that. And also every Disney film ever. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you like NCIS. I'm sure the other bits where there were no victim blaming of women are fine. So the last thing is from the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, and they looked at soaps. And this, I mean, this is terrifying. So 42% of the storylines in soaps depict a victim wanting to be raped. That's ridiculous. That's so high. 38% depicted a victim lying about rape. So we've got this, you know, strong narrative that victims of rape are probably just making it up, and that will influence the general public. 46% featured the victim asking to be raped. You know, these are really strong messages being put out into our media, watched by millions of people. So we've got to be really aware that even though victim blaming is horrible, it's actually normal. It's normal. There's this I don't think it's in these slides, but there's this really interesting study for any of you that work with children in CSE and CSA, that children, so parents of children who are abused by someone else, so not obviously not not if the parents are the abusers, if the children are being abused by, let's say, a third party, a stranger, a friend, an uncle, whoever it was, if the child is under 10 or 11 years old, the parents are very unlikely to blame that child for sexual abuse or rape. Once they get over that 10 or 11 threshold, victim blaming increases from the parents as they get older. And there's something really interesting there about that parents see their children under 10 as like little innocent children, like, oh my God, I can't believe somebody has done this to my child. But then there's something that changes when those children get over 10 or 11 years old, where parents are much more likely to blame their own children for being raped or abused, where they start saying, well, why were you there? Why didn't you tell somebody? You know, what did you do to bring this on? So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. If you want to have a look at that study, I can probably dig it out for you if you need it for anything. And then I collected these in 2017 when I was writing something else. And this is in the British media. So you can see that, victim blaming in the British media. And I just wanted to show you some of these. So Loose Women in 2016 held a poll on afternoon television. Can women be to blame for rape? Loads of complaints were submitted about this poll. But it was more about one of the presenters, I think it was Denise at the time, commented that if she was walking around drunk revealing clothes on, it would be her own fault if someone raped her. Now, obviously, the issue with that is that Loose Women is very influential, and it's usually seen as like a panel of strong women that all have their opinions and got something to say for themselves. So for one of those women to then make you know, really overt statement that, you know, it's her own fault if she's raped was not great. On This Morning in 2016, Eamon Holmes finished an interview with a young girl by telling her that maybe in future she should get a taxi home. Now, this is actually more problematic than that, but it's very short explanation. You can look this up. This was the story of a young woman who was abducted and raped right near a house on her way home. She was, almost home, and dragged into a car. And while she was being attacked, because she'd watched loads of NCIS, funnily enough, she'd watched a show where a victim had like pulled her own hair out and spat on the floor and dug her nails into the back of the rapist's head so she could get DNA under her fingers. Now, something clicked with her while that was happening, and she did it. That's in a really twisted way. That's how she ended up on This Morning, because she was being put up as like the perfect victim because she'd fought back, she'd spat on the floor, she pulled her own hair out while she was being raped and left it in the car, and she dug her nails into the back of his neck like that, and then gone straight to the police and had the DNA analysed under her fingernails. Now that's like, how rare must that be? It's ridiculous. So, but she was held up as like a perfect victim. She'd done everything she could. And even though Eamon Holmes had literally just done this whole section with her saying she'd done everything she could, and isn't she amazing? As he finished, he turned to the camera and said, maybe in future you'll get a taxi home. And I was just like, what did I just watch? I couldn't believe it. You can see there the headline from the 20th of July about the murder of a woman. Woman drank 6 Jaeger bombs in 10 minutes on the night she was raped and murdered. Like, why are the Jaeger bombs even in the headline? It what like and what so like, she's dead. Why are the Jaeger bombs in the headline? It was a horror. That is a horrible way of suggesting that the fact that she was drunk led to that. And so, yeah, that was awful. And then we had these issues that went sort of 2016, and then it actually went into 2017, which was the media coverage on schools banning school skirts and shirts that show female collarbones. And the reason for that was that it was distracting male teachers and it was distracting male students from their education. Um, and this was a number of secondary schools around the country. It actually started with one particular secondary school, and then a number of other head teachers sort of spoke up and said, oh, we agree, or we believe the same thing. And I think the major issue for me here was the blatant sexism was sort of like, the girls shouldn't be showing their collarbone because it's affecting the education of the boys. Sort of like the girls are a distraction, the boys are here to learn, okay? And then the other issue here is the teachers. It's like, if they there you go. Can you see it now, Helen? Is that okay? Um, that they that obviously it's distracting our teachers, and I sort of thought, if one of my male members of staff came to me and said, the collarbones of the girls that I teach is distracting me, I would suspend that man, and I would be very concerned about why exactly he is becoming so distracted by the bodies of children. And it was so interesting the way that the media and the schools put it out as like a legitimate issue that male teachers shouldn't be being distracted by children's bodies, like girls' bodies, or their skirts are too short, their shirts are showing their collarbone, it's inappropriate, it's affecting my job because I'm trying to teach and I'm getting distracted by young girls. It's like, do you need a bigger red flag? Like, what more do you need to suspend that member of staff? So we have a lot of examples of victim blaming that are, and they're spoken about just really openly, like these examples that I've shown you here. And then I wanted to show you some stuff from one of my studies. And it's called the Bosefor Study. Bosefor stands for Blame of Women Subjected to Sexual Violence and Abuse. Bosefor is the acronym for my psychometric measure, which will measure blame of women. And so, for short, I just call it the Bosefor Study because it's just a lot of waffle, really. And so these are some of the examples of the items that I gave to the British public. So a woman sends a lot of naked pictures and videos of herself to a guy she's dating from work. Using the pictures, he then blackmails her into kissing and masturbating him. 56% of the sample blamed her for that. And so what I did was I presented 55 items that presented different forms of sexual violence and different forms of sexual abuse, assault, exploitation in 55 different ways, and then looked at, which ones cause very high levels of blame and which ones cause lower levels of blame. Um, this one, a woman who sends her friend's boyfriend pictures of her cleavage is then upset when her friend finds them and uploads them to the internet. 68% of the sample blamed her, basically, in a sort of, well, if you're going to send pictures of your cleavage to someone, it's your own fault if it ends up on the internet. And then there's the added issue here that it was a friend's boyfriend. So obviously there's going to be some people that think, well, she deserves everything she gets because she shouldn't have sent it to a friend's boyfriend. A woman who has been homeless for months is offered somewhere to live if she performs sex acts on a number of men each night, so she moves in. 45% of the sample blamed it. And now, as you know, because I said earlier, this was not, men that were blaming, this was men and women, because there was no significant difference in the way men and women responded to these. So a woman has been homeless, she has nowhere to live. Somebody else says to her, oh, well, you can stay with us, but only if you, I don't know, give blowjobs to every guy every night. She's homeless. She has nowhere. A lot of people are exploited when they are homeless. 45% of the sample still blamed her though. And then there's a couple more here. A woman keeps receiving naked pictures from a work colleague, but she's too scared to tell him that she's not interested, so he keeps sending them. Now, so 40% of the sample blamed her for this, for basically not being assertive enough, that it was her fault that he kept doing this because she didn't put a foot down. A woman gets so drunk that she keeps blacking out in a guy's flat. She wakes up the next morning naked and he tells her they had sex during the night. 41% blamed her. Now, the reason that I put in a few items like this was because I was very interested in the amount of women who are raped while asleep or while semi-conscious. I've worked with so many women who have told me they've woken up and someone is having sex with them, or they've woke up in the morning and they've got no underwear on, and they'll say to the person like, why have I got no underwear on? And they're like, oh, we had sex. I'm like, I don't remember having sex. Oh, you were asleep. Like if they're taking painkillers or if they're unwell and things like that. And what was interesting in that was that actually quite large proportions blamed her for it, even though she wasn't even awake, which is incredible. So some of these findings were a little bit scary, as you can imagine. But this is one of the things that I want to show you. So all of this analysis really meant that I was able to pin down 7 factors of victim blaming of women. So this is specific to women. If you're interested in the factors related specifically to the victim blaming of men, Emma Sleeth's work on this, she did a PhD on it and then has published a number of articles on it, and I cite her a lot in my work. Obviously I focus on women, Emma focuses on men, and she has looked at the reasons why men and boys are blamed for sexual violence, and that's more things like homophobia, toxic masculinity, gender role stereotypes around men, the disbelief that rape even happens to men, things like that. So what had never been done before is looked at the reasons why we actually blame women and girls for sexual violence. So the first one is probably what you'd expect, is that they asked for it. They did something that asked for it. The second one was that the situation she put herself in was dangerous. So that's sort of the type of victim blaming when someone goes, oh, that's awful to hear about that woman that got raped, but why did she get in a taxi on her own? She should have been with her friends. It's sort of like if she's going to put herself in that situation, and it's her fault, what's going to happen to her? And we see that even with children. We see that in CSE as well. She should have said no clearer or fought back more. Now, this one is about assertiveness. So every time I wrote an item where the woman was either too scared or tried to say no but didn't really know what to say, or tried to say no but didn't fight them off, the victim blaming went up. So there seems to be a real expectation on victims that they're supposed to like gently sex offenders and like drag them to a police station and pretty much do everything themselves and beat them to a pulp. And it's just not realistic. It's a very, very rare response to sexual violence is actually, fighting somebody off. Male entitlement in relationships and consent by default was the type of victim blaming that I found when the women were in relationships. And, I don't know, for example, there was an item that led to this where I described a husband that just wanted sex all the time and told his wife that that was her job. And the victim blaming of the woman went up. And it was sort of like, well, there's got to be something here around male entitlement, that people believe that men are actually entitled to sex regularly. And then the consented by default was that sort of women who were ill, in bed, asleep, and the male partner just assumed that he was entitled to have sex with her even if she wasn't fully awake. The man was a non-stereotypical offender. Now, this one was interesting. When I described the man as handsome or friendly or professional, things like that, the victim blaming changed significantly, actually, but not on the woman. It actually changed on him. So it was more that when and you'll know this because you'll see it in the media. So when men are described as successful, handsome, friendly, popular, victim blaming sort of shifts around because it almost starts looking at the woman like, well, is she lying? Because he wouldn't have done that. This is obviously someone trying to get money or whatever it is. The event conforms to the stereotypical rape myth. So my research found that when all of the factors are there for a stereotypical rape, so the victim is injured, the offender is a stranger, it happens at night, it happens in an unfamiliar location, there's weapons involved, you're held at knife point or at gunpoint while you're raped, victim blaming of women drops massively, like down to like 1 or 2%. Sometimes up to maybe 2 or 3 or 4% maximum. So when the event conforms to that stereotypical rape, people see them as a real victim. They think, oh my God, that's a horrible thing to happen. She was, just walking her dog and a man came up to her and with a knife and dragged her into a van and beat her up and raped her and that sort of thing. And people see those as a real victim. And so the victim blaming really dropped there, and the blame of the offender went right up to like 99%. So people see that as real, and the rest of them that you can see in that list, they're just not real. There's ambiguity about who's to blame. The last one that I found was one of the strongest themes that came out, and I've called it she's a sexually active woman, and that was that if at any point the woman or girl has been sexually active before that rape, there is a very high chance she's going to get blamed. So whenever I described the woman or the girl as having been in relationships before or enjoys sex or, I don't know, like likes to look desirable or whatever it is, if she is perceived as sexually active, the victim blaming went through the roof. It was sort of up at like 50, 60%. Of the sample thought it was her fault. So whenever I described them as enjoying sex, dressing a certain way, liking, feeling sexy, anything like that, if she's a sexually active woman, she deserves it. So it was, that was really concerning for me. So that was just some of the findings I wanted to show you. So we're going to talk about theories. So we started talking about this earlier. We were talking about, why we think this happens. And so I'm going to talk to you about the key theories, and actually they're really useful for practice. I'm not sure what sort of people all do, but they, whenever I teach this stuff, it really does help people understand what's going on. So this is a little bit small at the moment, but I will zoom in when we need to. So the first theory is belief in a just world, and this theory has been being about since the 70s around victim blaming, of why we blame victims. And at first it was sort of seen as the theory. It was like the answer. This is why we blame victims. And you can see there that I've given you some little diagrams to explain it. So the best way to explain belief in a just world to somebody is that it's the theory and the bias, it's a cognitive bias that we hold, that if you're a good person and you live a good life, then good things will happen to you, and bad things won't happen to you because you're a good person. But if you're a bad person, then bad things will keep happening to you. And so it's the theory that the world is a just and fair place, it's a balanced place, and that bad things happen to bad people who deserve it, and good things happen to good people who deserve it. And you can see here in the middle in pink, I've given you some examples of how we embed that in language. So I'm really interested in language. So you can see things that people say all the time. Karma will get you in the end. You'll get your dues. What goes around comes around. You get what you deserve. You reap what you sow. You'll get what's coming to you. This is embedded into a lot of languages and a lot of cultures. People genuinely do believe that there's this cosmic force that goes around making everything fair. So, if you've done something horrible, eventually it's going to come back on you and bite you. There's no evidence for that. The world doesn't work like that. But it is actually a major core part of religion. A lot of religions are based on the belief in a just world. Religions, they might call it Judgment Day, or they might call it karma. They might call it retribution. They might, like there's all of these different concepts within religion and different cultures, that there is something bigger than us that watches everything we do, and then it come back at you if you have done something wrong. Now, the reason that this was linked to victim blaming was obviously because if something awful has happened, to someone, so they've been raped, they've been sexually assaulted by someone, the people who have a very strong belief in a just world will look for what they did to cause that to happen to them. What bad did that person do? So you can see that I've written there, if something bad happens to you, it must be because you're a bad person and you're being punished for something. You must have done something to cause the abuse. And even though we might not say that in practice, a lot of our practice is based around that. We're looking for what was wrong with the child, what was wrong with the family, what was missing out of this kid's life. Why were they going to the hotel? Why did they go to the party? Why was this woman raped? Why does she continue to, be exploited in prostitution? We're always looking for a reason in the individual of something bad that caused that to happen to them that we can then fix in some way. And we also do that whole good things only happen to good people thing. And you hear people saying things like, like when someone's won the lottery and they say, oh, it couldn't have happened to a better person. They're such good people. They really deserved that. And so we convince ourselves that if something really, really nice happens to someone, it must be because they deserve that to happen. And actually, bad people have brilliant lives, and good people can have horrific lives. You'll know people in your life who have never hurt anyone and not capable of harming another soul, and they have had a horrific life and they are repeatedly abused, exploited, harmed. And you'll also know people in your life that are vile and they harm a lot of people and they don't have a lot of empathy and they continue to harm people and they've got a great life and not a lot really happens to them and they do well, they've got a great job, they've got a nice family, and they're doing fine. But belief in a just world is just such an interesting theory. I've written a lot about it recently. The only thing I can tell you from an evidence-based point of view, though, is that it doesn't really hold up when we're looking at big, like national studies. So if we get a massive sample together and we look at, do these people believe in a just world, and then do they blame victims of sexual violence? The evidence is all over the place. So sometimes you'll find a strong positive correlation between these two things. Sometimes you'll find no correlation between these things. Sometimes people find a negative correlation between, I don't know what's going on, but it clearly is not the answer to victim blaming. And that was what interested me, was that for so long in the literature, people just said, oh, it's this is why people victim blame. And it can't have been. So the next one is attribution bias. And attribution bias is a cognitive bias about the way we attribute causal reasoning to something. So you can see I've written here, attribution is a good example of irrational thinking. It refers to when we make errors about when we attempt to find reason and cause for our own behaviours and other people's behaviours. So it's when we're looking for a cause, for a reason. And so some people have argued that attribution error causes victim blaming. So you can see the two examples that I've put there. So this is the person talking from their perspective. I'm so upset all the time. I can't believe I was sexually assaulted at school. They were bigger than me. I didn't know it was coming. They attacked me. They did this to me. Schools should have protected me. And then from the external view, they have emotional difficulties. This is about the victim. They were sexually assaulted at school. They could have just fought them off. They should have seen it coming. They should have protected themselves better. Now, this is because in the attribution bias literature, the argument is that we tend to attribute external reasons for why something happens to us, and we attribute internal reasons for why it happens to someone else. So an example of that is, imagine you have somebody in your office that you work with who is always late for everything, or someone in your family, they're always late for everything. It's like they've got some sort of problem. They're just late, like chronically late. And you think to yourself, they're always late. They have some sort of like time management issue. They never get up on time. They're disorganized. You know, they need to like grow up. They need to get a grip. They're always late. They're never organized with anything. And you can hear me. I'm talking about these individual blame issues. We're saying they are disorganized. They have an issue. They can't get up on time. However, attribution theory argues that if it was us that was late all the time, we would attribute external reasons. So we would say, oh my God, the bus was late, and then this happened, and there was traffic jams, and the roadworks, and the kids, and I tried to get the kids to nursery, and then I got them halfway to nursery, one of them's got one shoe missing, oh, I've had the worst morning ever. And every single time you're late, you have this like backstory of all the things that went wrong. You don't walk in and go, I'm sorry I'm late, I'm disorganized, and I've got issues with getting up on time. You don't say that because you attribute an external cause to why something's happened to you. So that's like the basics of attribution bias. Now, what's interesting about that, and you can see that the title there says, you know, is it shaky evidence? And that's because if this was true and attribution bias explained victim blaming, then why doesn't it explain self-blame in sexual violence? So attribution bias would argue that we attribute internal issues for why someone was raped or abused. So we would say, oh, you know, they're naive, they're vulnerable, they should have seen it coming, they could have fought them off. Now that I agree with. I agree with that external attribution. What I don't agree with is the other way around, because actually I've not worked with victims of sexual violence or like people that have been subjected to sexual violence who will sit there and say to me, it wasn't my fault, it was all them, they did this to me, they forced me. You know, they'll actually blame themselves. And they might say, I should have fought them off, I should have done this. So what that suggests is that in sexual violence, not only is the external person blaming the internal workings of the victim, but so is the victim. And that's where I think attribution bias isn't quite telling us really what we need to know about victim blaming. So I wanted to show you that. And then an add-on, like sort of further thinking from attribution bias, was the defensive attribution hypothesis in 1970. And the text here is super, super tiny, so I'll zoom in a second. And what I've done is I've made these little cartoons to explain it, because when you first start talking about defensive attribution hypothesis, it does sound rather clever, but it's actually a very simple concept. So if we zoom in, so we have this guy here. He is of the same ethnicity, same age, both wearing glasses, both got a beard. It's a big beard, both bald. So I've written here, when the victim of the sexual offence is perceived as very similar to the observer, victim blaming is less likely. So what that means is that if in this scenario, it's this guy, if he feels similar to the victim and he identifies with the victim, he is able to have more empathy and therefore blame will drop. So they'll think, oh, that could have been me. Like, that guy's just like me. We're the same age, we look the same, we work in the same job. Like, this could have happened to me. And then victim blaming drops because of that empathy. So you can see here what I've done is, as we go down, here the victim is still a man around the same age, but he's perceived as different because he's from a different culture. Victim blaming is slightly more likely when the difference is perceived. So in this situation, we've still got two blokes, they're still around the same age, but they're from a different culture. And therefore, this first guy here with the beard over here is more likely to blame this guy because there's a perceived difference. So according to this, you know, defensive attribution hypothesis, there is a perceived difference there, empathy drops, and therefore victim blaming goes up. So let's have a look a bit further down here. So now we have a very different person. So here the victim is still of the same ethnicity, but is now a young female. The observer is much more likely to blame her for what happened, as he doesn't perceive his experience to be similar and he has less empathy for her. So this is where you start to see big differences. And then right at the bottom, the victim is a young black female. The observer now perceives them to have no similarities or common ground. The large differences significantly reduce any empathy, and therefore she's very likely to be blamed. Now, this theory is interesting. I remember finding it. However, I'm not 100% sure this bears out because, well, I'll tell you why people thought it did. What this type of thinking caused was people who believed that women needed a female worker, men needed a male worker, boys need a male worker, girls need a female worker. And they said that it was because they could relate and because they felt safer. And that's like right at the top of this diagram here. That's the equivalent of this or this here, is that you've got someone very similar, same ethnicity, same sex, and therefore you're getting this higher level of empathy, lower level of victim blaming. And you'll know yourself if you work in this, that's not necessarily true. It's not always true. You know, sometimes you'll work with girls who really get on with a male worker. Sometimes you're going to work with boys that don't want a man, they want a female worker. And actually, the perceived differences might be a strength. The other thing that this caused was the assumption that, for example, South Asian women that were seeking support for domestic violence must have a South Asian support worker because they'd understand their cultural and religious priorities and experiences. And what's interesting about that is actually, whenever you look at the research, especially around South Asian, Black Afro-Caribbean communities, sometimes they don't want that. They don't want someone from their own community because it feels too close, it's too risky. So actually, they would be better off with someone very different to them who have a large set of differences so that they don't feel too close and too connected while they're trying to disclose and seek help. So that's why, you know, that theory is very interesting. Doesn't really work out all the time, although I would suggest that the Syria conflict and the refugees fleeing from there, I think this bears out, and that's a good example of it. So I don't know whether you saw much on social media, but there were a lot of white British people that could not empathise with those families at all, even when their children were dying, even when there was pictures of dead kids in the newspaper. They just couldn't place themselves. They just saw all of those Syrian refugees as scum or as less than or as poor or as trying to come here and take jobs and benefits and stuff. Even when you challenge them and say, if we had civil war in this country, you would be in exactly the same position with your kids and you would want to leave, they still cannot find any empathy for them at all because they just don't see themselves as similar to them. They just think, oh, that would never happen here. We're different. We just do this. We just do that. And in this case, that's a really strong example of this type of victim blaming and theory, because of course, you know, that is a form of victim blaming, the way that the victims in Syria were sort of, I saw posts online that said things like, they should stay there and fight. Like, why are they running away? I thought, oh, shut up. Like, most people in this country would not stand and fight if something like that happened here. We'd all run away and we'd all want safety for our children, but we're too busy blaming the victim. As you brought up right at the beginning, sexism and misogyny is also really important to victim blaming. You can see here that I have this lovely Lynx advert. I actually had to chop her legs off because they were so long. I can't even fit them on my slides anymore. And then on top of that, she had like 8-inch stilettos on. And she's roasted a perfect turkey in lingerie. She also has full hair and makeup done and extensions in to roast the turkey for when the man gets home. So I chose this because of how women and girls are being portrayed. And you can see here that I've sort of defined hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. We often talk about hostile sexism quite a lot, and that's the obvious stuff. But benevolent sexism is actually the stuff that causes the most problems on a day-to-day basis. It's this sort of underlying, subtle, more careful attitude about women and girls. It's not, the man that says, you know, oh, women make bad leaders, women are rubbish at maths, like women are just good for cooking. That's that really hostile, sort of really, in your face, obvious sexism. You know what that is. Benevolent sexism, as you said there, it's sort of like it seems more socially acceptable. It's things like always holding the door open for women because we can't open doors, or always offering to help a woman carry her bags because she's weak. Um, always, you know, I don't know, just sort of assuming, making assumptions that women are weaker and less than, and but doing it in a nice way. It's the best way to explain it. Um, this sort of like, oh, you shouldn't have to go out to work all the time. You're a woman, your job is in the home, you should be looking after your children. Why are you at work and putting your children in childcare when you should be at home being a mum? That's that benevolent sexism. So I have got here some issues that are definitely contributing to victim blaming. I've written an entire review that's coming out in my new book around porn, the media, sexual imagery, and this sexism and misogyny, and it is just incredible. Like, it's not hard to write a book about that. You could write 15 books about that, and you would not run out of material. Women and girls are sexual objects to be enjoyed. Obviously, this is all going to increase victim blaming. Women and girls should look a certain way. Now, this was really interesting because when I did that first exercise at the start and I wrote down my little list, I wanted to remember to talk to you about some findings about women's weight. And that's that victim blaming has actually been found to increase based on how much you weigh and whether you look overweight or underweight. So the findings are like the most like frustrating. They're frustrating findings. So the first finding is if you as a victim, as a girl or a woman, are sexually assaulted or raped, and you're in court and you're overweight, you're visibly overweight, or you look overweight, for example, or you don't look like what you're supposed to look like in the media, that's the best way to put it. You are much more likely to be victim blamed, and you are also more likely to get a not guilty verdict for the offender who raped or abused you because you're overweight, or perceived to be overweight. And that's because it was found that jurors sort of question why anyone would rape a fat woman, was that if she's bigger or she's fat, then a man wouldn't want to rape her anyway. So she either must have led him on, or she must have caused it, or she's lying. However, if you're in court and you're very attractive and slim, you're also likely to be blamed more, and you're also likely to get a not guilty in court, because you're too attractive, and therefore you led them on. It was your fault, and the man couldn't help himself, and it's because of the way you look that person offended against you. So you sort of, I don't really know what you're supposed to be honest with you, with that one. So that's about the way that we look, right? Women and girls should act sexy but not slutty. Quite a lot of research around this dichotomy. This tightrope we're supposed to walk between being sexy enough but not a slut. Sort of being desirable but not too desirable, being pretty but not too pretty. And that's a real issue because girls are fed that from a really early age, that they're supposed to be presentable and pretty all the time, but if they go too far, they're a slut and then they deserve everything they get. Now that's a big problem, and we've got young girls talking about this now. We have women that say, adult women will say things like, oh well, I can't get my boobs out and my legs out because then I'm a slapper. Like, who says that? What rule is that? So you're basically sort of saying, oh, I can get my cleavage out, but I have to wear jeans. Because then I'm sexy but not a slut, or I can have my legs out but I have to wear a jumper, because you can't have both at the same time because that makes you a slag, right? So we've got this like constant sort of narrative that if a woman or girl does something or looks a certain way, then she's really bringing it on herself. I've written here, women and girls should be sexually available, but they should also engage in token resistance. Now this one, is so it will yeah, I'm just basically going to ruin every rom-com you've ever watched. Token resistance is the concept that a woman is supposed to say no a few times before she believes or accepts that she loves a man or that she wants to have sex with a man. So that's like every single film with Hugh Grant in ever, because Hugh Grant plays like a professional sex pest in every film he's ever been in. So it's like this sort of concept that men are supposed to keep pestering us because eventually we'll realize that our resistance is futile and that we really do love those men and we really do want to be in a relationship with them, or we do want to have sex with them actually. So, but the social element, the social norm is that we're supposed to say no a few times because otherwise we're easy. So if you have sex on a first date, then you're a slag. But if you say no a few times, even if you don't mean it, that's token resistance. That's, you know, means you're a better woman, a better girl. Now, what that means is that films, dramas, soaps, music videos that teach token resistance as being normal, and this sort of concept that if a woman or a girl doesn't resist a few times, then she's just being easy. It teaches boys and men that when a woman says no, she doesn't mean no. She actually means just keep trying. And that's where you get this harassment, stalking element, pushing people into sex that they don't want, because they've been taught that when someone says no to them, they don't actually mean no. They sort of mean maybe later, in a way. I'm just checking if there's anything else there that needs explaining. No, I don't think so. They're very self-explanatory. And then the last one is rape myth acceptance. I've left that one last because people expect that that's like the sort of most obvious one that everybody thinks. I'm just having a drink. What's it? Um, you know, that sort of the myths about rape, that what is a real rape, what's not a real rape. So I'll zoom in so you can have a look at some of them. If the sex offender doesn't have a weapon, it's not a real rape. And then you get that sort of, well, not only do you get the external victim blaming, you then start to get self-blame. So you'll get victims saying, well, was it really rape that happened to me, or am I just overreacting? Maybe it was just bad sex. Maybe I should just like chalk it up to experience, right? If you act like a slut, you shouldn't be surprised if you get raped. I actually wrote an item like that into my own research. You'd be surprised how many people agree with that, because it is clearly written to be so overt that you would expect nobody to agree with that. People still do. If both people are drunk, it cannot possibly be a rape. That's a very common rape myth, that if you both had a drink, then there's nobody that's actually culpable. If you don't physically fight back, you can't say it was a real rape. Now, this one's a big one because loads of women and men that I've worked with who have been raped, this is one of their biggest things. It's sort of like but I didn't fight them back, but I didn't scream for help. But, you know, what if I had fought them back? Then none of this might have happened, you know. And actually, that's very unrealistic, and you have to sort of spend a lot of time breaking that down with them. But it's actually also in our criminal justice system, you will be asked, you know, what did you do? Did you push them off? Did you say no? Did you shout for help? You know, couldn't you have got out of it? Couldn't you have, you know, couldn't you have done this? Couldn't you have done that? And it starts to feel a lot like blame. In fact, actually, the research shows that when women and girls go and report to the police, if they are asked those types of questions, they very often come out of that interview believing it was their fault, even if they went into it not believing that. So we actually cause victim blaming in our own systems. It probably never happened if the victim has no bruises or injuries. There's quite a lot of studies with police officers that show that if the victim attends the police station with no obvious bruises, injuries, and has not attended a SARC for an examination, it's very unlikely that they would take that victim seriously. And so, you know, it's getting slightly better with more historic sort of reports coming through. But it's still there. There's still recent research that has asked officers, you know, what is a real rape? And it's always, you know, the victim's seriously injured. They've got, you know, big hand marks or bruising and things like that. Another rape myth is that lots of girls lie about being raped. So obviously, the false conviction, the false allegation rate is probably between naught and about, I think at the moment the research shows about between naught and about 3%, depending on the study. And even then, I always question, what do they mean by false allegation? Because I remember working on a case once that was actually reported as a false allegation, and it wasn't a false allegation, it was that we couldn't get the evidence. So and I think there's a big difference there. You know, the difference between an actual lie and a woman or a girl coming forward telling you that all this stuff has happened and then us not being able to corroborate it because there's no evidence because it happened 6 years ago and she never told anyone. That to me, there's a big difference there between what those things actually are. Um, okay, if there's any other rape happens when a guy's sex drive goes out of control. That's actually an item from the IRMA, which is the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale, which is one of the psychometric measures that we use to measure rape myth acceptance. And so, yeah, the rape happens when a guy's sex drive goes out of control. That's that sort of explanation of, oh, it's not men's fault, they have a really high sex drive and sometimes they get a bit carried away and they don't mean it. That's that type of rape myth, which is awful. All still very, very prevalent. So when I was first looking at all of these issues, I developed this model, started using it in my work in 2017. And this was me sort of using the ecological model, which is Bronfenbrenner's work, the ecological model of development around the fact that the individual doesn't develop or exist in a silo, it exists in these systems, so microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem, and that we all exist all the time in these systems of influence, and support and, you know, other things that are going on. And I started thinking, well, maybe this is how victim blaming works, that victim blaming occurs at every single level of an ecological model. And then it sort of gets filtered down into the individual, and the individual ends up taking this in over the years. They take it in from the media or from porn or from rape myths or from just world belief, individualism, from the support network, from their family, from the education system, from the police, from the CJS. And then eventually over the years, they blame themselves because they've been fed thousands of messages that it was their fault. And you know, I don't not believe that this is true. I just have a more sophisticated way of looking at it now. And I actually, you can't see it, but on the back end of my office, there is a version of that that's like 3 meters high and it's stuck on the wall. So I'm not going to get away from it. But it makes me think about it all the time because it's not wrong. And I have included it in the PhD, but it's a more updated version. And it was a really good way of structuring the literature and the literature review. So, you know, oftentimes you can use ecological models like this to look at complex social issues like sexual violence, victim blaming, you know, forced marriage, FGM. You know, you can look at them because actually nothing just exists at an individual level. It never ever does. You'd be surprised how far it will reach and what's causing the constant acceptance of those beliefs. So this is my slightly more complicated version, which comes out this year. Slightly meaning horrifically more complicated. It is very small, and so I can zoom in a little, but it won't help massively. What I found was that all of the main theories that we just talked about, when you really dig them down, it's just this really, is that humans are seeking control, justice, safety, a hierarchy, and order. All of the theories fit into one of these or multiple ones of these, right? And I started thinking, this is why we're not getting anywhere in this literature, in this field, because we are not seeing the underpinning issues that humans are trying to achieve. They're trying to control the world, themselves, life, safety, order, justice, who's in charge, who's lesser, who's better, who's more important, how do you control the masses, right? And so you can see here at level 2, we have the ways that we do this. So one of the ways that we achieve these things at the top is through faulty logic and beliefs. We convince ourselves of things. We believe in religions. We believe in just world belief. We convince ourselves that with self-preservation that could never happen to me and I'm safe and we live a better life and this neighborhood's got a lower crime rate and stuff like that. So this is one way that we achieve this. Patriarchy and sexism is another way that we achieve these things. We control, justice, safety, hierarchy, order is all part of patriarchal culture. And obviously in this part, it oppresses females. And then the last one is religion and cultures, is that humans built these belief systems so that we could cope with complex social life. Humans are social creatures. We are, everything about the way we're designed, even our faces, are about communicating with other human beings. But that's very difficult. There's a lot of us, and a lot of us are idiots. So we have to find a way to live together in some way. And religions, cultures, rules, laws, ways of controlling millions, billions of humans. We've tried to do that. We, for the most part, succeed sometimes. Um, and then from these, we have the actual things that we do in sexual violence. So faulty logic causes self-preservation and denial of our vulnerability. It causes myths and beliefs about sexual violence. The patriarchy also feeds into these things, and misogyny and gender role stereotypes. Religion and cultures feeds into a number of these different things, but also feeds into special forms of stigma, shame, and cultural norms that you only see in certain religions and certain cultures, but you don't see elsewhere. Um, and then these are the ways that all of these really harmful things are communicated through religious practices, cultural practices, the support net, which includes the family, our education system, porn and sexualization, mass media, marketing, authorities like the police, like the government, like the NHS, like, you know, big or like even smaller authorities like your CEOs, your charities, the big national campaigns, things like that. And then you've got law and legislation. And so it's a rather more complicated version of my little circles. So I am going to bring this out with like a whole explanation with all the literature and the evidence that backs up every single bit of this, which is absolutely terrifying, by the way. And we'll just see how that goes. And I expect that this will be picked apart. It will be, messed with over the years. Authors will agree with it. Authors will completely disagree with it. And that's just kind of the nature of trying to build a model of human behavior. It's very difficult. So we're going to finish off by having a look at some real stories that I have from. So these are pseudonyms from women that I've interviewed around the country who were subjected to sexual violence and blamed themselves. So this is Sasha. She says, so I've experienced a number of different rapes, I guess, and was your kind of, I guess, best case scenario in some ways, in that, there were witnesses, a stranger jumped out of nowhere, and he was an illegal immigrant. So, on the face of it, that's as good as you're going to get as a victim to any kind of experience in terms of how people are going to perceive that. Now, Sasha, when I interviewed her, she is talking about, she uses the phrase best case scenario. She also uses the phrase as good as you're going to get as a victim. So that means that she knows all of the things I've just told you about, and she's measuring her rape against that. She's thinking, who was the offender? Where did it happen? Was there witnesses? Was it nighttime? Was it daytime? Was it this? Was it that? She's thinking to herself, how credible am I before I go and report this? And so this is really important, because what this suggests, and what I've written about in the PhD and in the book, is that women and girls have been given these stories for so long that when they are abused or raped, they know those stories so well that they'll measure themselves against them. She's thinking to herself, right, there was witnesses, he jumped out of nowhere, and he was an illegal immigrant. So people are going to believe me, right? Now, what actually happened in Sasha's case was that the police did come, and the police took her to the station, to talk to her. And it was going quite well. That was her sort of perception of it, that they believed her. And then they looked at her case file, and she'd been raped before, and she had been raped before, and she was exploited when she was younger. And straight away, it was like, well, that's a negative. Like, so this has happened to her again. She retracted the last two. Then they said to her, have you been drinking? And she said, well, I was on my way home from a meeting after work, and we went to a bar. She was like, I've had maybe 2 drinks. Wine, that's it, really. And they were like, right, so you've been drinking as well. And I remember her telling me in an interview that she could feel the measurement going, mm, mm, like she could feel like her credibility drop because she knew she was like she knows what they're measuring her against, and this is really bad because she shouldn't have to be processing all of that while she's actually disclosing a rape to the police, but she is constantly predicting what's going to come next based on what happens and whether she fits the victim, what I've called in my, and I've got another model, it's not here with me, it's called the victimhood hierarchy, which is basically where you are on a hierarchy depending on the criteria of the rape, you, the offender, things like that. So I'm going to show you another one. So this is a transcript of me talking to Jane. Again, Jane's a pseudonym. Um, so she says, if I'm not, if I've not done a thing wrong, why do people keep coming for me? Why can't they just move on to someone else? I know it's horrible to say. And I just sort of said, yeah, I get it. I get what you're saying. And she says, but you do. It's just something that goes through your mind at first. And it's like, why do they keep coming back for me when I've done nothing wrong? So what these guys have been saying must be true. They must be right. And I must blame myself because I've done something wrong. But then I don't know if I am one of them people because I can't see myself doing anything to lead anyone on. Now, Ja- Jane was like a lot of the women that I interviewed in that they don't blindly accept blame. None of the women I spoke to blindly accept victim blaming. They play with it. They pull it apart and they sort of accept some of it and then don't accept others. So Jane is actually accepting quite a lot of blame here. But then right at the end, she's like, but then again, I don't think I led anyone on. So she can feel herself being blamed, and then she's thinking, hang on a minute, I I didn't do that, you know? And actually, quite a lot of the interviews went like this, and it changed my theory of victim blaming because quite a lot of the theory in victim blaming suggests that children and adults just sort of absorb it. They sort of take victim blaming in, they absorb it into their own thoughts. But actually, my research shows that's not true. They accept some of it, and then they challenge some of it. They fight the rest of it. And actually, over a period of time, that will keep changing and keep changing. So at some points in their life, they might blame what they were wearing, and then they might come to the conclusion, hang on a minute, that's stupid. But then they might think, oh yeah, but it could have been because I was drinking there. And then they'll get to another point in their life where they'll think, hang on a minute, I should be able to go out and have a drink and not get raped. And so they are always challenging their thoughts. It's not this sort of one-dimensional, um, oversimplified version of like our psychology. You don't just take on someone else's belief and go, oh, that must be true, and that's it. Like people don't think like that. So this is a good example of Jane sort of trying to challenge that. And then the last one I want to show you is Danielle. Now, I will read this out because I'm not sure how small this is showing on your screen. Yeah, so basically, I went to see a psychologist, and when I came back to England, and he said, look at yourself. You're a professional dancer, you're tall, beautiful, and blonde. What did you expect? And that's exactly what he said to me. So I walked out of that room and I changed my whole life. I mean, I started going back to my natural hair colour, but I dyed my hair black. Yeah, I changed everything. And I thought if I could block that bit of my life away, then it didn't happen, and I wanted to cover it all up so I could pretend it didn't happen. I agreed with it. I thought I agreed with it, and I changed everything about myself. And I guess that's where some of the changing of yourself, like your hair and your life, is protecting myself. I didn't get as much attention from guys at all when I had black hair. I stopped dancing too. I opened a dance school for a few years and then I stopped. Now, this particular case really bothered me because Danielle was a professional dancer. She was a ballet dancer actually. Very, very good. She was in, all of the sort of like really famous ballet productions in Russia. And she was raped by a famous sports person. I didn't ask her who that was. I genuinely don't know who it was. Um, and obviously Danielle's a pseudonym. And she went to see a psychologist because she was struggling so much with the trauma responses. And before she went to see the psychologist, because the person who raped her drugged her, so she was fully unconscious. She has no recollection of what happened whatsoever. She never blamed herself. She had this really rational, logical sort of, I was unconscious, I was completely drugged, I had no idea what was happening, this wasn't my fault. It was only when a psychologist, someone in authority, told her it was because she was tall and beautiful and blonde and because she was a professional dancer, that was when her self-blame kicked in. And that again is sort of like contradicts what Jane was feeling, is that actually Danielle did take that view on. She did take it on. She challenged it over a long period of time. But initially, she walked out of that room, she cut her hair off, so it was very, very long, cut it very, very short, dyed it black, she quit dancing, she never went back to ballet, and she left where she lived. And she was convinced that the reason that she was raped was because she was tall, beautiful, and blonde. And so she stopped wearing makeup, she covered her body, she cut her hair, she dyed it black. She did very practical, obvious things that were based on that comment from that psychologist. And that psychologist changed her life in a really negative way, because they introduced self-blame that she didn't have and she didn't need. And she lived with that blame for a very, very long time before I met her. And actually, the interview with me, I remember her saying to me, it was the first time anyone had ever challenged any of these things. You know, she'd been thinking that maybe they were wrong, because what had happened a few years later was she was raped again, but in a relationship with someone she loved. And that threw all of her logic out, because she's not dancing anymore. She's not got blonde hair anymore. She covers her body now. So why has she been raped again? And so what this brings in that would be useful for you in practice and useful for you in theory is called counterfactual thinking. Counterfactual thinking is a cognitive process that we do, where we say things like, if only da 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 da, then this da 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 da. So we might say, if only I'd never gone to that party, then I never would have fallen out with my sister. Like, those two things are not related at all, but we convince ourselves they are. So we might say, if only I was not a professional dancer, then I would never have been raped by that man, and therefore I'm going to quit dancing. So the dancing did not cause the rape, the man did. The offender caused the rape. But actually, what we do is we hook it on things that aren't relevant. So counterfactual thinking is very, very common form of self-blame. Some people argue that it's positive. So there's been a number of theorists that argue that self-blame and counterfactual thinking is actually a psychologically positive mechanism, because when you blame yourself and use counterfactual thinking, it makes you think you're back in control. And feelings of control increase feelings of self-esteem and makes you feel back in control of your life again after sexual violence. So when, for example, someone says, you know, oh, I was raped in a bar and now I don't drink and I don't go to bars anymore and now I'm safe, for a long time they're going to feel safe. And for some people, they'll never be raped again, and it almost causes confirmation bias that it was the bar that caused the rape. For other people, they're going to experience it again, and it's going to completely throw it out. So what happens if the person who is told, well, the reason that you were raped is because you went to a bar and you were drinking, what if that person stops drinking, doesn't go to a bar again, and then a few years later is raped at a family get-together? So in the short term, it can increase psychological well-being, and in the long term, it tends to affect them quite a lot, because they'll eventually have this massive realization that they're not safe, because nobody's done that work with them, and they've always thought that they've made themselves safe by changing these things about themselves. So some of the key findings from my new literature that's coming out is that women have a lifetime of victim blaming messages and rape miscommunicated to them from every level of society. And they apply them to themselves to measure whether they think they're to blame, but also whether they think other people are going to blame them. But women are not passive agents who just absorb messages from society like a sponge. We are not just a sponge in a pot of water that just takes in everything around us. That was something that somebody said to me about women, and I just love that metaphor. But they're right. We're not an empty vessel. We don't just absorb every bloody belief that everybody gives us. The women that I interviewed are dynamic, and they wrestle with and question and fight victim blaming and self-blame whilst applying it to themselves. But you can see in brackets there, I've put, but not to other women. So a lot of the women that I interviewed blame themselves, and they could give you 1,000 reasons why they blame themselves. But if I then switched it over to be about other women, they would just tell me that they weren't to blame and that it was the perpetrator's fault. So I found that interesting. None of the women I interviewed blamed other women, but they blamed themselves. Women mainly blame themselves for not saying no clearly enough or not being able to escape. Now, this links in with some of the weakness that I talked to you earlier about and some of the 7 factors of victim blaming that I found in my work. They sort of position themselves as not being assertive enough or letting it happen. But what was actually interesting about this is that it wasn't true. So in the interviews, the women gave me loads of examples of what they'd done to try and stop this from happening. Women told me they'd said no repeatedly. They told me they'd tried to fight them off. They told me they had threatened them, that they were going to tell somebody. They told me they'd pushed their hands away. They told me that they'd pushed them. They told me they'd shouted at them. But they would still then tell me that they never did enough. Oh, I wasn't assertive enough. I don't have the confidence. I didn't fight back. But they'll say, yeah, you did. You just told me that you did. Yeah, but you know what I mean? Not enough. So that means there's this like real expectation that's what I mean about it being like I think they're expected to like kickbox them to death or something. But actually, they are being assertive. It's just that they don't feel like they were. And the last one was women change things about themselves to protect themselves from sexual violence and then realised it didn't protect them. Now, this one's really important for practice because we are very guilty in practice of convincing women to change themselves. So we say, oh, don't go there again, don't go drinking on your own, always take a phone, don't get into taxis without your friends, build your own confidence, change this, do that, change where you live, go like, and actually we and women themselves give that message that if the woman could just change herself, if she could change her behavior, change her character, change something about herself, this won't happen to her again. And actually, we have globally, women have a 1 in 3 chance of being raped in the lifespan. So that's rather unlikely that changing something about ourselves is actually going to be a variable that would change whether we're raped or not, because it's just so common. But we do it to keep ourselves safe. Professionals do it to make them feel like they're helping, but it actually is not that great long term. So we're coming to the end now, so you can start thinking of any questions that you want to write in the chat box and I can talk to you about them. I will try my very best to figure out how to turn all your mics on. So if you've got headphones or you can talk through your laptop or your phone or your tablet, then we can do that. So these are the outcomes of the studies. So I've got a new theory of victim blaming, self-blame of women, which I've started talking to you about, a new psychometric measure of victim blaming of women, communication of victim blaming messages in society, which is what I've shown you, the hierarchy of victimhood based on myth and blame, which I've not shown you. I've got a new book coming out, Why Women Are to Blame for Everything, which is a deliberately provocative title, by the way. New anti-victim blaming resources. Oh yeah, I forgot to show you these. Have you seen these yet? Oh, I'm just so proud of them. So these are the Belief in a Just World flashcards from Victim Focus. I might just showing them to everyone right now because I only got them yesterday after I've worked on them for ages, and now I've got this like big shipment in of everybody's pre-orders. And so these are, so it says there, you can see on the presentation, it says anti-victim blaming resources that are coming out for professionals. And do I just love these bloody flashcards. I've always wanted to build something that was like really easy to use. So we suggest that they're like at the moment 12 and up, but it's going to go through peer review and then we'll get an idea of whether that's correct or not. It might not be. And each one has a different statement on them, so you can see. I don't know if you can see. I'm hoping you can. That one says, I remember I choose to dress. And then if I flick maybe to another one, this guy here, he says, we should place 100% of the blame on perpetrators. And all of these different cards say something completely different based on my research findings. I'm just trying to find you a different one. I like this one because you can then challenge if you're working with a woman or girl who tends to blame herself, but she doesn't blame other women and girls. So essentially, the way that you use these is like just flexible. It's, you know, you could use them with groups, you can use them in universities, use them in one-to-one therapy to start challenging some of these beliefs that people hold about sexual violence and abuse. But anyway, you'll I just wanted to show them because they're here, and I just keep showing them to everybody. So if you are absolutely welcome to stick around and ask some questions. I am really pleased that you have listened all the way through. That's pretty impressive. You can see there I've got the special event on the 21st of May in Birmingham. Tickets I think are about 40 something or 50 something quid. It's a whole day looking at all of this new research, doing activities around victim blaming with professionals and people from over the country. It's in central Birmingham, right near New Street Station. So I'm really looking forward to that. And obviously the PhD will be over then. So fingers crossed. It'll, you know. But I have written also there, decades more research and activism is going to be needed on this. This is not going to go away overnight. A lot of what Victim Focus does, obviously, is specific to this, and I've got all the new e-learning coming out and resources and whatnot, but it's going to take a lot of shifting and challenging to get us anywhere. We also need to be constantly challenging the media and education of children, you know, to make sure that we're not bringing up another generation that believe that, you know, victims of sexual violence and abuse just bring it upon themselves, especially with it being so common. So then, has anybody got any questions or comments? You're absolutely welcome to just put them in the chat box there before you go. I'm going to stop recording now. That doesn't change our communication. Like you'll all be here, I'll be here, but it means that this stops now for YouTube. So